Let's learn how a for loop works in C#. Whenever you're going to do some piece of code over and over, you're going to use a loop. There's three types of loop we use: a for loop, a while loop, and a do while loop. I usually use the for loop when I know the certain number of times I'm going to do something. In other words, there's a count associated with it. I'm going to go ahead and create a brand new project, and I'm going to call this one for loop, and I'll make sure it's a Visual C# and a console app. Click OK. It'll create our project and solution for us. And then what I want to do is I want to prompt the user to say how many times do you want to do something, and then I'm going to have a loop execute something over and over. So the first thing I need to do is declare a variable. I'll call it iCount, and then I want to go and gather a bunch of names. So that's going to be a string, and I'll say sname. Now I need to create my loop. But first, before I do that, I want to prompt the user to enter in the number of what to do. So I'm going to do a console.writeLine and say how many names to enter, ? And then I'm going to go ahead and get that data by saying iCount equals console.readLine. But remember, I need to turn that into an int, so I'm going to do a convert dot to int 32 and then put all of the console.readLine in it. So that's going to go and get data from the keyboard, convert it to an integer, store it to the variable. Now that I have that variable and the count of how many times to do something, I'm going to do my for loop. The syntax is for. I put a space, you don't have to, but the for loop is made up of three positions. The first is the initializing of a counter, int, and we'll say inum equals 0. This says we're going to create a variable called inum of type integer and initialize it to 0. I'm going to use this variable as the counter as to how many times to stay in the loop. The next part of the for loop, position 2, is your expression that keeps you in the loop. So I'm going to say as long as inum is less than iCount, I want to stay in the loop. So in other words, whatever the user types in here, let's say they wanted 3 names. As long as 0 is less than 3, you'd stay in the loop executing code. The third position of the for loop is what do you do to this counter? And so I'm going to say inum++, which simply says take this counter and increment it by 1. The first time through, inum is equal to 0. Is 0 less than 3? Yes, drop into the loop. Increment it. Is 1 less than 3? Yes, drop into the loop. Increment. Is 2 less than 3? Yes, drop into the loop. Increment. Is 3 less than 3? No, get out of the loop. Then you actually put braces for the loop. If you only have one statement, you don't need the braces, but just get into the habit of putting those braces. And it says whatever follows the for loop in braces is attached to the for loop and will be executed every time this condition is true. It'll drop into the loop. I need to point something out. If you notice on a lot of your C# statements, you'll have semicolons to end the statement. You do not, let me repeat, do not want a semicolon here. In fact, C# tries to help you by saying, I think you're making a mistake. If you put a semicolon there, that ends the for loop. And so whatever you have here is not attached to the for loop. In this loop, I want to now prompt the user to enter in a name. Enter a name. And then we want to go ahead and get that data from the keyboard. Sname equals console.readLine. And then I want to go ahead and print it out. And I'll put your name is, and then I'm going to use the plus sign. Plus sign is concatenation. It says take one value and stick it to or glue it to another value, and I'm going to go ahead and print out whatever name they just typed in. So when I run this program, it should prompt, how many names do you want to enter? We go and get the data from the keyboard as a string, convert it to an integer, store it to that variable, drop into the loop, set a counter equal to 0. As long as that counter is less than the number I typed in, do this loop once, increment the counter, check the expression, do the loop, increment the counter, check the expression. So in other words, the order for processing the for loop is step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4. I'm going to go ahead and add a console.readline just to pause our screen, and I'm going to run this and let's see what happens. So we execute the program and it should prompt us on the screen that says, how many names do you want to enter? We want to enter 3 names. Enter a name. Mickey. Print off, your name is Mickey. Enter a name. Donald. Enter. Your name is Donald. Enter a name. And each time, after it comes back through here, it says, increment the counter. So I come back over to here and enter a name. Goofy. Enter. Your name is Goofy. And now it's waiting for me to press a key to continue. So it actually stayed in that loop 3 times, executing that code. Well, let's do something else. I want to actually display the count on this line. So let's say for name inum plus the name is, I'm going to drop this to the next line so you can see it all on one screen. So now for each name they type in, I'm going to say for name, and then I concatenate the counter variable, and then I'll put the name is and whatever they type in. Let's run it one more time and see what happens. How many names to enter? Let's do 3 again. Enter a name. Mickey. For name 0, the name is Mickey. Enter a name. Donald. For name 1, the name is Donald. And Goofy. For name 2, the name is Goofy. So as you could see, that loop was actually incrementing that counter. It started off at 0. It said, is 0 less to the number they typed in? It is less. So I execute this code, and then I increment the counter to 1. Is 1 less than that? Yes. Do all this. Increment to 2. Is 2 less than that? Yes. Increment, set it to 3. Is 3 less than that? No. Get out of the loop. In other words, don't execute this code, but drop below the loop. Now what if I actually wanted to enter in for name and I put the number 1, 2, and 3 rather than 0, 1, 2? 2 different things I could do. The first thing is simply to start my loop at 1 and say less than or equal to. If I ran that one more time, enter 3 names, Mickey, Donald, and Goofy. Notice this time I started the counter at 1 and I made it to 3. Another thing I could do is, let me put this back to 0 and we'll say less than. Another thing I could do is what they call post-increment. So this would say, is inum equal to 0? Yes, drop in. Enter the name, Mickey. For name, it used to be 0, now let's make it 1. The name is Mickey. But then we come up and change it to 2. Is 2 less than I count? Yes, drop in 3. In this loop, it's not going to work well. You could actually leave off that 3rd position counter if you're doing the count inside of the loop. Let's try it one more time and see if that works using the post increment. 3 names. Enter a name. Mickey, Donald, Goofy. Same thing. But if I had left that counter back in that loop, so now I'm changing the counter and changing the counter, watch what would happen. 3 names. Mickey. That one looked good. Donald. That one doesn't look good. And I actually don't even have another prompt. It's just waiting for a keystroke. So be careful how you increment the counter. If you're incrementing it right here, be careful about incrementing it down in this loop. You have to do one or the other. I usually like to leave it up there and do that. And then you could go ahead and do a 1 and 0. So we start at 1 and then we stay in the loop as long as we're less than or equal to. The for loop is a precondition loop, meaning it checks this condition right here before it drops into the loop. If I said inum was equal to 10 and I entered in a 3 from the keyboard, I dropped into here. Is 10 less than or equal to 3? No, it's not. So this loop never gets executed. So you need to remember, the for loop is a precondition loop. It checks the condition before entering the loop. So in other words, since it's a precondition loop and it checks the condition before it drops into this, it might not ever execute at all. This loop might, or this code for the loop might never be executed. So the minimum number of times it could be executed could be 0. That's how precondition loops work, and that's the for loop.